Adeeb Xolid is the Jane and Raphael Bernstein Professor of Asian Studies and History at Kарлton College, where he has taught since 1993. He received his BA from McGill University in 1986 and his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1993. Although Xolid teaches widely in Russian, Soviet, and Ottoman history, his scholarly work is devoted to Central Asia in the modern period. From the late 18th century on, Xolid has published 4 books to date: The Politics of Muslim Cultural Reform, Jadidism in Central Asia, University of California Press, 1998. Islam After Communism, Religion and Politics in Central Asia, University of California Press, 2007, which won the Vicinage Prize in 2008. And Making Uzbekistan, Nation, Empire, and Revolution in the Early USSR, Cornell University Press, 2015, which won the Zelnik Prize in 2016. Central Asia, A New History from the Imperial Conquests to the Present. Xolid is a member of the editorial boards of Slavic Review, Central Asian Survey, and Cahiers de l'Asie Centrale. He was a founding member of the Central Eurasian Studies Society and served as its president in 2005.
Dear audience, today we are in the city Sent Pol, in one of the beautiful and green cities in the United States. We are organizing some interview in the frame of our project, which is called Creating a Constructive Transdisciplinary Model for Popularizing National Strategic Ideas of Jadidism. And today our guest is a prominent historian, the author of a lot of books which devoted to the history of Central Asia and Uzbekistan, moreover the Jadid thought, a professor of Kарлton College, Adeeb Xolid. Dear Professor, first of all, I'm thankful for you for agreement for this interview. And my first question will be about your way for this field. What inspired your interest to the history of Central Asia and particularly to Jadid's period?
Let me start by saying what a pleasure it is to host you here. This is a wonderful honor for me as well to be included in this series, and it's a delight to have dear friends from Uzbekistan come visit me at home. In terms of how I became interested in Central Asia and my interest in Jadidism, so I grew up in Pakistan during the Cold War. And in my high school years, I became aware that even though Central Asia, Uzbekistan was very close, so I grew up maybe 1,200 kilometers from Tashkent. But during the conditions of the Cold War, we knew nothing about what was going on in Central Asia. Our histories were deeply connected, but our present in the conditions of the Cold War was very, very different and very distant. So I became sort of obsessed with Central Asia, about trying to find out more about that. So this is how I became interested in Central Asia, and that it was a place so near and yet so far in the 1970s. Then I was lucky enough to be able to make Central Asia the subject of my studies at university. And then when I started my graduate studies and I had to think of a topic for my dissertation, I have been interested, again, because of growing up in Pakistan in the 1970s, in sort of questions of Islam and modernity and Islam and the modern age, and what does Islam should mean to us. There were many debates on this question, and in the 19th century, early 20th century, in the whole colonized Muslim world, there were big debates on the question of what was to be done. And something very influential in South Asia, in India and Pakistan, was something called Muslim modernism. And that was something of deep interest to me. Then when I began to think of a topic for my dissertation work, then I thought that what was going on with similar debates in Central Asia in a different imperial context. And this is how I came to Javidism.
Thank you very much. Very full answer for this question. It's well known. The Jadids were repressed, and then their thoughts and works and whole ideology were banned.
Absolutely.
Step by step. Even in time of perestroika, where increased very great interest to the thought of Jadid when their theory put in the center of indefinite ideology. This process also was stopped a little bit. It was connected with some official ideology when first president as creator of independence was officially recognized of this process, and contribution of Jadids for this big events as independence
arised from independence period.
But your work from the first book, which
Was
devoted to the Islamic cultural reform, which was published in 1998, and then Islam after communism, after 1 decade, published in 2006, and finally a very famous book, Making Uzbekistan, in 2015. Especially this book was published in lifetime of first president. But it's very interesting that all this book, which you created, was created from one another, or it was one pre-systematic plan which was created before with you as part of other book, or some complexion.
It's in some ways, so Islam after communism was a different kind of book, but the Muslim cultural reform, which is now available in Uzbek as Turkestan da Jadidchilik, and Making Uzbekistan were sort of part of the same project. And that lasted for a very long time. So I became interested, actually after Jadidism, I was also interested in sort of the interaction between Muslim modernism and socialism. And way back, Alexander Benixen, the French scholar, had written a book called Muslim National Communism. And this was all during the Cold War, before the archives were open. And I was fascinated by this idea of how communism and nationalism and Muslim identity could come together. And he had written mostly about Tatar figures, and Sultan Galiev was the Mir Said Sultan Galiev was the most famous character. And I have begun to think of, what might be going on in Central Asia during the period of the Russian Revolution. So this is how it all began as a single project. But then this is when I was starting in graduate school. There was very little information. The archives had not yet been opened. And so I started with Jadidism before 1917, before going into the period of the revolution. So in some ways, my first book was sort of the muqaddimah, the introduction.
Other books.
Right. And Making Uzbekistan was the one that I had really always wanted to do, but it required, a lot more work than I had originally thought.
Usually social thought and theory of modernism should be based on concept. After the Soviet era and during the years of independence,
the war,
some discussion about Soviet occupation policy of being with the X. The mood of decolonization is Uzbekistan created under this attention for being of the X. But in your book, Making Uzbekistan, there another approach to explain the delimitation process as consolidation between Soviet regime and intelligence of Central Asia, like Jadids.
Right.
In this point, could be another position for Jadids to put some blame for you in delimitation process. But delimitation were some kind of problematic for Xolid also. He was forced for him, but even Uzbek people didn't have any benefits from this delimitation from the point of territory. Whole historical heritage of Central Asia integrated to the Uzbek identity through the activity of Dalits. From this point, can we estimate this process as following process as it was written in the theory of autopoiesis of Matura, or another author of social thought, as if we view this an opportunity for jadis of Central Asia, intellectuals seeking to construct a national theory, can we consider this situation to be authentic manifestation of social thought, as it was explained in the theory of autopoiesis of Matura?
Okay. Well, I think the argument I was trying to make in that about national delimitation, I was arguing against a lot of scholars, especially in the West, who simply see the delimitation as a Soviet or a Stalinist plot that was meant to completely dismember Central Asia. And what that view does is it does not actually take into account the historical complexity or the agency of any Central Asian actors. That was one argument I was making. The other argument is that it was not simply a victory of the Jadids. That's not true. I don't want to make that argument. The process of delimitation was part of a broader Soviet policy. And was initiated from Moscow. But the idea that political and national or linguistic boundaries should coincide existed everywhere else in the Soviet Union by that time. And Turkestan was the last part where that had not been undertaken. So it was a Soviet policy. But again, the ideas of the nation were there. The idea of what Uzbekchilik would be was, I argue in that book, was really formulated by the Jadid, especially by Abdurrauf Fitrat, not by the Bolsheviks. And it was in this very complicated set of circumstances that you have the creation of these national boundaries that come to be based at some level on the ideas of the Jadid. Another thing that perhaps sometimes they use the word Jadid in a very broad way. And I think we can make some distinctions between people who were Jadids in the sense that they were involved in debates over cultural reform before 1917. Such as Mahmoud Khuja Behrudi, Abdul Fitrat, Abdullah Abdulani, Mona Farqari, and so on and so forth. But then there are a lot of new people who enter political life, and mostly through Soviet and party institutions after 1917. And many of them had a very different background than the Jadids. And so someone like Torah School for instance, he's not really a Jadid in the sense that he was not part of any debates about the new method schools or Muslim reform or anything like that. So most of the participants in the debate over delimitation, it was carried out in the party. So most of the people who were participating in the debates were members of the party, of the Bukharan Communist Party or the Turkestan Communist Party. And some of them, Faizullah Khojayev is very central, and he's a Jadi. But many others were really ultimately Muslim communists, and they are not exactly the same as the Jadids.
So there were several groups which involved to this historical process.
Yes, exactly. I think that sometimes that distinction gets it disappears especially in Uzbekistan. I think there is a difference of who joined when and what path brought them to public life. And most of the old Jadids never joined the party. Abdul Rauf Fitrat never joined the party.
Yes. So it's principle way not to be joined.
Not. So there are many things they shared. This idea of, and after 1917, Fitrat came to fascinated by the idea of revolution, but not a Bolshevik style revolution.
Yes.
So I think those distinctions we need to make a little bit more clearly. And so ultimately, I think the argument about delimitation is that the idea of, especially of the Uzbek nation, that sort of won out. And that you have in Uzbekistan based on, that was the idea ultimately of Abdul Rauf Fitrat and his friends and colleagues. And it was Fazlullah Hojayev, who is Fitrat's friend and disciple, who wrote the proposal for the formation of Uzbekistan on the basis of Bukhara. There's a document that I've published from the archives. So there you have a clear link to the Jadids. But ultimately, the people who were arguing were Central Asian communists. But also it was Central Asian communists. It was not agents of Moscow telling them what to do. So that's the argument I'm trying to make in there. And that is a very complicated historical moment.
Special ingrained details.
Yes, exactly.
It's very difficult to explain in every chapter, in every construction.
Exactly. And, if that delimitation had happened 5 years earlier, would have been completely different. Because this is also the moment, the time when all these ideas of identity are crystallizing. That in 1905, at the time of the first Russian Revolution, the debates were completely different. Or if it had happened 10 years later, who knows?
Jadis were such a group when people make them into heroes in time of needs, or even in the beginning period of Soviet regime, they were as bourgeois nationalists. And just after some became as enemy of nation. The approach for Jadids to investigate them in any specter and in every view, following until so far. For example, in later articles in modern time, we can see, for example, in the article of in Aftership, Jeff Aden, Paulo Sartori in Devin Davis, which calls moving beyond modernism, that is studying as Salafi groups. But in your approach, we can see some type of dialectical or synergetic method, when this approach has always created their greatness from their weaknesses. And question is that can be Salafi elements situated in one frame when Jadis tried to shape nationality or national identity or national processes, which is not close to the Salafi principle.
Yes, this is a complicated question, and I have many disagreements with the authors that you just mentioned. Let's see. I think Salafi elements, Salafism in itself signifies a modern understanding of Islam, and there are things that it shares with the viewpoint of the Jadids, but it also shares with the viewpoint of Sadun, the so-called official Islam of the Soviet period. All of that goes back to some criticism, everyday practices that the Jadids called safsatalar, khurafatlar. And there is an Islamic basis for that critique. But to say that just because there is that element in there, they are simply Salafis is to completely misunderstand the historical process. Because they arrived, the Jadids and Muslim modernism was a very widespread phenomenon across the Muslim world in the 19th, early 20th centuries. What they all arrived at that position was through a fascination with the idea of progress, of taraqi, and that then led the Jadids to the idea of the nation, which today's Salafis are not interested in. So just because there's some element in common does not make the Jadids identical with today's Salafis, first of all. Second, I think scholars like Deviz and Saftori are fascinated by a certain kind of Sufi-based Islam, which they think was completely authentic and untouched by state power. And that is a deeply problematic set of assumptions. It's this fascination with the sources that they read, which I don't think they properly contextualize. And it's this fascination with the pre-modern, some sort of pure, authentic Central Asian Islam that is also, for people who study Islam as a phenomenon, would reject most of those suppositions as well. So that's the core of my disagreement with that approach. And I would say that we need to treat the Jadids as any other human actor, as a product of their time and place, as human beings who were often full of contradictions. They have their hopes and their desires, their weaknesses and their strengths. And I think there's an impulse among some people to make them into pure national heroes. That is also a little bit problematic because they faced a great deal of opposition from their own society. But also to say that they are either just Salafis or more, I think the bigger argument that Sartori and Deviz make is that they were just insignificant, they were not important, and the real life of Central Asian society was somewhere else. I think that is also very problematic.
Yes. In order to eradicate entrenched Orientalism and colonialism, decolonization process is very necessary for today's Central Asia in every country. And in your article, which was published in last year, 2025, in November, which related with the ASSIS Congress, it was called as Spotlight on Central Asian Studies. You explained Kazakhstan, the colonization process from a very positive point of view, especially they're trying to create new films, books, and principles in governor. It can be some kind of element of the colonization. But
What do you think? There are what kind of shortcomings in Uzbekistan?
Okay, well, I think what I was saying in that article was that decolonization or decolonial thought has a number of meanings, and I'm not sure everyone who writes about that means the same thing by that word. And some of those I am very much in favor of, and some other aspects of it I find I'm a little bit more skeptical. In that, I think my basic understanding of how culture and societies work is that we are a product of our past and of all the experiences that our society has undergone. And it is not so easy to completely just take out one element, the colonial, and throw it away. Because even how we think about the decolonial is through the process of that experience. So I think some of the thinking in Kazakhstan goes a little too far. Because then if you want to dismiss everything that is Soviet or Russian, then I'm not sure what is left. And the argument becomes one of ultimately a fairly essentialist argument for authenticity, I firmly believe that authenticity is something that people argue about, but it cannot exist. There is no other than making a purely essentialist argument. So that is my take on the colonial thinking, that it has to be done right. Yes, of course, there are lots and lots of Orientalist and colonial elements, concepts that we take for granted, and I would say that a great deal of Western writing still, and a great deal of Russian writing about Central Asia is not free from those concepts. But we cannot argue either from a complete rejection of the Soviet or the Russian past. Just as no one writing about India or Pakistan can basically just throw away everything. The people who try to do that are sort of, politicians, not scholars. I think what is happening in India today with the current government with its Hindutva policies, they claim to be decolonizing Indian history. And that means basically expelling all Muslims from the narrative of Indian history. And that is, if that's decolonial thought, then I don't want to have any part of that.
For young specialists, will be question about your activity in archives, because you gained a lot of experience during your working career in several archives of Central Asia and Russia. And what conclusion have you drawn during this activity? What is important in the working archives?
Yeah, well, the archives. I'm old enough to say that when I started graduate school, the archives were not open, and people had told me in the West that, the communists don't keep any archives; they just burn their evidence, which turned out to be completely wrong. The archives are so rich, and my first few days, I sat in the archives. I had to pinch myself to make me realize that, no, I'm actually reading. So I've worked in Uzbekistan and in Russia, mostly in Moscow, and I've spent a few days in Kyrgyzstan in the archives. And I have to say that these archives are also a product of the Soviet state. The Soviets created a union-wide structure for organizing and administering archives, and which is why the archives are very similarly organized in Kiev and Vilnius and Vladivostok and Tashkent. And they're really very well organized, actually. And the cataloging is very good. However, my first few days in the archives, I was very excited, but then they give you a microphone, which is often quite of poor quality, and you read it on a 40-year-old microfilm reader. And so the physical difficulties or the practical difficulties of working in the archives are also something that we need to keep in mind.
It's in archive kinofoto documentов, yes?
No, even in what is now the Milli Archive, a lot, well, not so much in Tashkent actually, but in Moscow, a lot of files have been microfilmed. So you just read it you don't actually touch the paper. And you read it on a microfilm, and sometimes the reader is of very poor quality. So the actual physical difficulty of reading sometimes is, maybe now I've not been to the Moscow archives because of the war for many years now, but maybe they're digitizing some material, but you still read a lot of it on microfilm. So that's just a sort of personal experience. The other thing with archives is the archives contain documents. They don't contain the truth. And so you have to read the documents as documents, and you still have to contextualize them, as opposed to, I still see scholars, young scholars, but even old scholars, just saying, well, this is in the archives, and therefore it proves everything. But you have to ask why some document was written and whose opinion is a certain document expressing, and in what context. And that, I think that is something, especially for young scholars, to keep fully in the center of their attention, that the archives contain only documents and paper, not knowledge and not truth, and certainly not truth.
Yes. Thank you. Finally, my question is about your life, which was devoted.
In which part of
your life, which devoted to the studying the teachings of Jadid and documenting their
honest
and objective history? Such loyalty, diligence, and truthfulness are not even observed in the work of local intelligence. When you, if we say that Jadids are some kind of cliff in your scholarship activity,
what does it mean for you?
and is it a special love for their thoughts, or scholarly ambition, or natural inclination toward creativity?
I think the last part, I'm very flattered, but I think it's a combination of all of these. I think there's a little bit of a difference between studying your own society and studying a different society. And in some ways, I was never very interested in studying Pakistan because I was fascinated by other places. But you're located differently. If you're studying your own society, and often you need only a little bit of language training, nothing because of the script change from Arabic to Latin to Cyrillic. Uzbek scholars will need some linguistic training, but still and then your relationship to that past is a little bit different. And you're writing for an audience that is your own society. And for people, if you're writing about another country, I think your relationship you still have to be honest and loyal, but I think your viewpoint is a little bit different. And if you're writing about Central Asia in English rather than in Uzbek, there is a little bit of a difference there. So you had earlier asked me about how the Jadids were banned, and then they were sort of pushed to the back during the first president. And again, I think working in the United States or working outside of Uzbekistan, some of those pressures are a little bit different.
Yes.
And you're not really subject to the
methods
and the methods and the interests. And And that applies not just to me, but, people who write about Russian history in the United States are differently placed than those who write about Russian history in Russia, or Japanese history in the United States versus writing Japanese history in Japan. So that's, I think, a general principle that your interest and your relationship is a little bit different. Also, so I did have to learn Russian and Uzbek, even though I don't have very much practice, and that's why I have to do this interview in English. But that was a great deal of time, personal investment to learn those languages. And so once you have them, you keep using them. But ultimately, I think I find the period of the early 20th century, especially in Central Asia, just very fascinating. So, and the Jadids as individuals, the Jadids as people living through a time of such great transformation. And the transformation is not straightforward. It comes from many different directions. And in some ways, it's more complicated in Central Asia than in many other places. So that's what I find the most fascinating. And that's why I have sort of spent all this time working on them. Finally, I should say that I started my aspiranturu, my graduate school in September of 1986. And at that time, if anyone had told me that the Soviet Union would cease to exist before I finished my dissertation, I would have referred them to a psychologist. And so I started with the assumption that I will not be able to work in Uzbekistan, the Soviet Union, and I will just do what everyone did, which is to find whatever sources you can find outside. When I started working on my dissertation, even the basic bibliography of the Jadids, like what had they written and what they had published, was not really established. Because, as you said, during the Soviet period, they were the first history of Uzbek literature that I read. And there's a 1984 history of Uzbek literature in Russian. It had 2 pages on the Jadids. Only. As bourgeois nationalists. And I was completely stunned. And so even the names or what they had written had to be re-established. And that began happening in Uzbekistan during Glasnost and Perestroika, and the work of wonderful people like Naim Karimova, Begaliaka, Qasimov, Shiriliaka, Turdev. They were the ones who brought these people back into, and I was sort of the beneficiary of their work, but I was sort of there at the beginning when these names were not really all that well known. And so there is some pride and some satisfaction I have, and that I was able to be part of that trajectory. I would say that I feel very, very lucky that everything turned out in my life, that I was able to all that I had hoped to do, because actually, doing a PhD in a topic like that and then finding a job is not always guaranteed. And I find myself to be really lucky to have been able to do that. And what that has allowed me to get to know Uzbekistan and to make many, many wonderful friends and spend time there. And that is what has shaped my life. So I'm just very grateful for all of that. But also grateful for all the wonderful friends I've made in Uzbekistan and all the time I have spent there.
Dear Professor, thank you very much for your interview, for your time, because it was a very unique interview with full of information. All of that works which you done in process of in late period of 20th century, in beginning of 21st century, it is big influence for historical subject, not only from the point of Uzbek history or Jadid history. It is history of world, which can be established one sustainable history in contemporary time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.